But leave the amounts aside for a moment. Look at the change in how complicated the forms are. From those 4 pages, what do we have now? This is the current 1040. If you include the instructions, 176 pages. How did this happen? Well, a new movie out this week tells the story. It's called An Inconvenient Tax.
During World War I, the top tax rate moves from 7% to 77%. And suddenly, taxes become a huge concern of a lot of people. People came to Congress. The first deduction, the first one that was really focused on the tax laws, was the charitable deduction. And that's because presidents of universities and colleges came to Congress and said, look, we're not getting contributions. You're taking 77% of the top dollars of rich people. So Congress said, well, we'll give you a charitable deduction.
And then people said, we need a lower rate for capital gains, and then a deduction for retirement plans, for children, and so on. Still happening, because everyone wants a break, and politicians love giving us gifts.
Give families a $10,000 tax credit for 4 years of college and increase Pell Grants.
And then the politicians applaud themselves for their generosity. And they campaign by making promises to the favored groups.
I'm going to provide a $4,000 tuition tax credit that helps parents be able to afford the price of tuition so we can go to college.
And that wins them more applause. And the tax credits bring us more pages in here. Can we bring a camera in closer? I mean, look at this fine print. 3,000 pages of stuff filled with these special exemptions. And partly because of all these exemptions, to get the money they wanted, politicians kept raising the basic tax rate. By the 1940s and 50s, the top rate was 90%. That changed, as the movie explains, thanks to JFK.
The first president of the modern era to embrace the issue of the income tax was John F. Kennedy.
He was the first president to realize that high tax levels stifle economic growth, and so he proposed
top-to-bottom cut in both corporate and personal income taxes.
His tax advisors came along and said, but these high rates retard economic growth. And that began the real conversation about the relationship between tax rates and economic outcomes.
He'd actually gone in and slashed the World War II and Korean War tax rates, the marginal rates across the board. He took the top rate down from 91% to 70%, and the bottom rate down from 20 to 14. And we had several good years of growth after the Kennedy tax cuts.
The movie gives much more history. These documentary filmmakers made it, Vincent Vittorio and Chris Marshall. So why'd you do a movie on taxes? Taxes are boring.
Well, John, it's the one issue that every American's connected to. And I think that we wanted to take an approach in which it didn't have a partisanship, and we were able to kind of explore more of the complexities of the tax code and give people a better understanding of why those complexities exist.
And you interviewed lots of people on all sides. And what was the main conclusion?
Well, one thing that virtually everybody who we interviewed agreed upon is that the tax code is way too complicated. And it doesn't do a lot of things that naturally would take place in our economy, people making decisions in their normal lives. Instead, they have to factor in the tax code in their lives. So
and that takes time and changes our behavior, wastes creative energy. I mean, the president who had some success in simplifying it was Ronald Reagan. After JFK, he was the next president to reduce taxes. Let's play some more of your movie.
We must go forward with a tax relief package. I shall ask for a 10% reduction across the board in personal income tax rates.
The context for him was the movie industry.
Hey, wouldn't it be something if the president came to see us?
He'd make a certain number of movies, and then anytime he made another movie, he figured that 80 or 90% of the income he was getting from that movie could go to the federal government. So he would stop making movies and go off and ride horses. He just became convinced, based on his personal experience, that a high tax rate discourages people from working hard and going the extra mile to be productive.
Well, 90% tax rates would do that. I'm glad it's lower now. But what else did you learn that surprised you?
The way that we get ideas for tax reform is from our politicians offering more and more relief. And what people don't realize is that these things have negative consequences. They all add to the complexity of the code. And what we want to try to let people understand is that there are other options out there besides things that add to more and more complexity that we can ask our politicians for.
Options like?
Well, simplifying the code can be done in several ways. And there are ideas to simplify the income tax, or as many economists believe today, going to something like a consumption tax solves a lot of the complexity issues. So we try to bring this debate up and have our experts talk about it in the film, and we're hoping that we can get this discussion started with our film.
And one of those consumption taxes is the fair tax, and we will have an expert talking about that later in this program. You also found that what makes people mad about taxes, and I think of the current Tea Party anger about spending, partially relates to taxes, it's not just the amount, but an unfairness.
Yeah, I think the issue of fairness is, a big part of the tax code. Let's go back to the Tea Party, the actual Boston Tea Party. People always look at that as a revolt against taxes, and, it wasn't really a revolt against taxes. It was against the loopholes in the system.
And your movie was news to me about that. Let's take a look. The exemptions mean some rich people pay less than some poor people, and you make a good point about the unfairness of that and how it was unfairness rather than the amount that sparked the original Boston Tea Party.
The U.S. was born of a tax revolt, but it was actually not a revolt against high taxes. The Boston Tea Party was a revolt against tax loopholes. The British had passed a law that granted certain special favors to a few merchants who were selling tea, and American merchants resented the monopoly that had been granted here and the tax exemptions that had been granted, and their objections to the British tax were really directed at the loopholes that were part of that tax, not at the tax itself. It's important because it is Americans' first experience with really throwing the tea into the harbor, but simply to say, we are not going to stand for this kind of special treatment.
If you think in those times how low taxes were, they were, 1 or 2%, and how different that is now. Today's Tea Party movement is about anger at just the size of government.
Right. The level of taxation is certainly a big issue to a lot of people, but another issue is the design of the tax code, and that sometimes gets not as much attention, but it's still a very important aspect when we talk about reform.
The design meaning all the social engineering, all the special rules to try to steer behavior?
That's one part of it. Every exemption, deduction, exclusion comes from the fact that, that's partially because we have an income tax and a democracy, and those things are products of that system. And so can you develop a system that doesn't have to deal with those sort of concerns?
Wouldn't it be nice? I mean, this is just so ugly. The only people who understand this are the specialists, and yet there's no movement really to do anything but add more pages, more special deals for this little group.
Right, and there are plenty of people that are getting the tax code to do what they want it to do, special interest groups and what have you. The American people, if they want to get their fair shake in the tax code, they need to pay attention to these issues. They need to be considering this an important thing so that it doesn't just work for the people who have enough lobbyists, let's say.
So you should pay attention. Thank you, Chris and Vincent.